All right, how's it going, everyone? So in this video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be overhauling this Chrysler 8 1/4 rear differential. This is a limited slip differential in a Grand Cherokee. The limited slip 8 1/4 Chrysler differentials have this weird kind of oval cover. The non-limited slip ones are just a round asymmetrical cover. So what we're going to do is we're going to tear this differential down. We got to remove both axle shafts, drive shaft, and the cover to get to the ring and pinion and the carrier assembly. From there we'll measure the turning torque of the pinion, the backlash, and try to look at the gear pattern. What this differential is doing is it is making a bit of a whining noise at freeway speeds. So you get a harmonic through the passenger compartment that's a little bit louder than it should be. One of the things that is a little bit misconcerning is if you can see this very distinct straight line of gunk along the entire differential. That's something that you should look for. That's kind of a telltale sign that this differential probably was sitting in some water. The good news is that's not super high. The vent for the differential is right there, so we still have a ways for the water to get in through the vent, but it can get to this little plug. But I doubt there's going to be any water intrusion in it, but it is something to pay attention. If you can have telltale signs that this thing was submerged, differentials don't like having water in them. So anytime you lift a vehicle, you want to make sure you increase that diff vent. So what we'll do right now is we'll remove the axle shafts, drive shaft, and everything else. With both axle shafts removed, the drive shaft removed, the cover removed, we can now start inspecting the differential. So the first thing that we're going to be inspecting is going to be the differential backlash. Now this differential has quite a few miles on it. I believe the truck has 135,000 miles on it. I don't know how long this diff's been going for, but they go about that long before they start making noise. The factory specification for backlash for this particular differential is going to be between 5 thousandths and 8 thousandths of an inch. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the pinion steady, because the pinion does have a pretty loose bearing, and then move the differential ring gear up and down. Now we're right at about 6 thousandths backlash, which is within spec, so that's good for the gear set there. Where we do have a bit of an issue though, like I said, is the turning torque of the pinion is pretty loose. So we have to measure that when we take the carrier of the diff out. That way we can see if the bearings have been worn out prematurely. This differential is from Chrysler, has the ability to have the backlash fine-tuned, so we'll have to remove these 7/16 lock nuts and tabs. And right in the middle of the case there, I don't know if you'll be able to see that, is going to be an adjuster. So we're going to use a factory adjuster tool. This is a rod that goes down through the axle tube, and we're able to turn the adjustment rods for both sides of the rear diff carrier. This diff carrier too, as I brought up at the beginning, is a limited slip. This is an electric limited slip. So we have our electric solenoid, so we do have to undo this electrical connection before we take the carrier out. At this point, now that we've done our backlash measurement, we can take the gear set out. The gear set is noisy. We could do a gear pattern check. I'm not really going to bother, because I can see looking at the teeth of the diff, it actually looks pretty good. There's no signs of it pitting or anything. So I think what this is just higher mileage vehicle, and potentially the bearing for the pinion's coming a little loose, and that's going to be our issue. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to take the center carrier out, and then we'll measure turning torque. So with the rear diff carrier removed, we can now measure the turning torque of our pinion. So we're going to go to the other end of the diff with our drive flange for the drive shaft, and just spinning this by hand, I can tell this is way too loose. Factory specifications for this diff with used bearings is anywhere between 10 and 20 inch-pounds of turning rotation, to where new bearings are 15 to 35. You shouldn't be able to turn it that easily. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a turning torque wrench with a 32 mil socket, and we're going to turn this, and we're basically at no resistance whatsoever. The needle isn't moving at all when I turn this. So the orange needle is just the reminder needle of seeing where it's at. The black needle is what we're actually turning on, and as you can see, there is absolutely no turning torque with this. So more than likely that's going to be our issue with this differential, is because there was no turning torque on this or preload on these bearings anymore. The bearings have created a little bit of noise, probably prematurely wear it, and caused the pinion gear to wear on a different spot of the ring gear, and it had gone out of adjustment. So what we'll need to do now is, we know we have an area of concern of what we need to be looking at when we take these bearings off. I have to take this drive flange out, and we'll hammer out the pinion gear and hammer out the two races for the pinion gear itself. We'll do that, and then take a look at everything, and we can start reassembling the diff after that. With our pinion gear removed from the housing, we can now inspect the bearings. I went through and hit out the inner and outer races for the pinion, and it's really tough to see on camera, but you can see to where this outer race for the small end, this is the farthest out bearing, is starting to brunel, or start to lose the finish on it. It's a bit discolored. The camera's really not doing justice, but it is kind of a golden color, to where it's been a little hot, and you can see where the lower edge is fogging, where it's starting to wear, and some of them do have chips. Same thing with the larger inner bearing as well. There's a bit of a ding on it. Looking at the actual rollers themselves, there's really not much you can see there, and there tends to not be, but what you're going to look for is any chips in any of the rollers. In this case, we just had a slightly noisy diff at freeway speed, so we're not really expecting a lot of chips or anything to be on these. Now, I already went through and pressed off the larger bearing off of the pinion, and the reason why we need to do so is this particular differential has a pinion depth shim that is located below the larger bearing on the pinion gear. Now, in my experience, I've found usually it's best if the differential is operating normal, with the exception of it just having like a wear issue. In this case, you know, the higher mileage Jeep, we have a wear issue with the bearings. Usually it's best to start with whatever the factory shim is for pinion depth, and then go from there after taking your different measurements. So we transfer over the shim, and then we'll press on a new, here it is, we'll press on our new pinion bearing. Some differentials have it behind the outer race, so you'll press out the outer race, or hit out the outer race in the case, and the shim for the pinion depth will be behind this. I've also seen them to where they're in between the little bearing on the outside. You're gonna have to refer to service information for getting that correct info for each diff. But in our case, we have the shim. It's gonna be put in place on the new pinion gear, ready to go, and we'll have our new pinion gear set in. Now, this is an interference fit, meaning that it's going to, the inside diameter of this is slightly tighter than the outside diameter of our pinion gear, so you do have to utilize a hydraulic press to push this on. Now, each diff has different size, big end bearings and little end bearings, and they do require special adapters to install these. Now, if you don't have the adapter, what you can do is you can cut the race off of, or sorry, not the race, cut the outer cage for the rollers off, and that leaves you with the inner race. And this is the perfect diameter to act against our bearing to press it down. And you just need kind of a pipe with the end welded off on it. And so you can have you have one of these, and then every time you do a new diff, you cut the outer cage off and you have yourself an installation tool without having to go buy one. So I have a fair amount of these. Every time I do a new diff rebuild, I end up cutting the race off or cage off and using the inner race as the tool. For installing the outer races, you use little puck adapters. These come in a variety of different sizes as well. And what you end up doing is having the puck adapter that fits in, almost dropped it there, the puck adapter that fits in the outer race snug and is hitting against this lip right here that's flat. That's not a bearing surface. And then you just use a bearing driving tool, hammer these into the differential case. You can pull them in. There's some screw tools to actually screw these in. Those are a little less violent and a lot nicer on your ears, because you do have to hit metal on metal. I already went through and installed the new inner and outer races, or sorry, both the inner bearings race, outer race, and the outer bearings outer race as well in the case. So that I've already done. It's simply just whacking these really hard with a hammer and making sure they're nice and set in the case, and you're not deflecting the case by getting them crooked or anything. You need to make sure you're hitting nice and even. This tool has the ability to center itself, so it makes it a little bit nicer. So what I'll do now is I'll press on our inner pinion bearing. We'll then get it set up inside of the diff housing. One of the other things to replace is going to be our crush washer. So our crush collar is this is what's going to keep preload on our tapered roller bearing set. So the one on the left is the one that came off, and you can see it's crushed a little bit more than the new one. These have to be replaced every time. You also run the risk too, when we're bringing this to the proper turning torque, we need to make sure we go in slow steps, because if you over crush this, you run the risk of it not having the correct preload, and you'll have to replace this, and you have to take apart the pinion again to get this back set. This is steel, so it does have a slight spring back, so you can spring these back a little bit if you just get slightly too tight, but ultimately these do have to be replaced every time. So at this point, I always like to put it on now so that I don't forget, and rebuilding the diff goes a little bit smoother. So I'll press this on, and then we'll get setting the turning torque for the pinion. All right, so at this point, we're going to install our pinion gear into the housing. Our next step is going to be to slide the pinion gear in through the end of the housing, and then we have to press on the outer bearing. There is an interference fit, just like the bigger bearing. What we're going to use to do this is a special installer tool. So what this does is this threads into the end of the pinion gear, and we're able to drive this in nice and smooth. It's less likely to have an issue then. It can be a bit cumbersome to set up, but it's much easier to control. The other thing I like to do is I like to put a little bit of gear oil on the tops of these bearings, just to have them have a little bit of a leg up when we first start and drive the diff. It also helps, I feel, in installation. One of the things to note is that some manufacturers do specify that these have to go in dry for the turning torque to be accurate. This particular diff does not specify that, so we're going to put a little bit of gear oil on it. It's 75-140, which is the spec for this diff, and drive it home. So we'll thread the tool all the way onto the end. When you do this with the pinion seal out, if you were to install the pinion seal, you'd damage it. So we thread it all the way on, and then from here we thread on the drive nut, and we're able to press on this diff bearing. Okay, so at this point we've bottomed out our tool. Now this hasn't crushed our crush washer. All this has done is driven the outer pinion bearing down onto the pinion gear. and stopped it against that crush washer. Benefit to this is now we have the pinion nice and secure in the diff to where we can do this at the preload, and we haven't potentially damaged the bearing if we try to force it all in at once. So the other method to do this is you can use a brass punch and tap around the race, but if you have the tools to do the job a little bit easier, it makes a whole world of difference. So now we'll just back the tool off by spinning the pinion, and we're good right there. So putting that little bit of gear oil in too, now that I've spun the tool off, that gets the gear oil all around the rollers and fully lubricated for us to drive down and get the turning torque set. So our next step is going to be to put in our pinion seal, and then the drive flange or yoke, depending on what terminology the manufacturer you're working on calls it. We'll get off all the excess silicone from the old pinion seal. Okay, so now we're ready to install the pinion seal with the pinion seal installer. This is just an aluminum cone that fits against the lip of the pinion seal so we can hammer it in. Some differentials, a lot of Danas, especially the smaller ones, like Dana 35s, will have an oil slinger that goes on next. That's to prevent fluid from going away from the pinion bearings. This differential doesn't have that, so we'll just put in our pinion seal. And it's just going to hammer in. That nice solid sound indicates that we're installed. I'm going to make sure that there's no gap anywhere. All right, nice and flush with the housing. So our next step is going to be install the drive flange. Now this differential does have a small amount of liquid Teflon put into these splines. That's to prevent fluid from coming around the inner bearing and going out the splines and causing a leak. So we're going to put a little bit of liquid Teflon and then install our drive flange. And engage a couple splines to make sure that it's going to go down correctly, and then just kind of tap this on a little bit, going back and forth to each side, make sure we're driving it on. Go back and forth on each side to make sure we're driving it on nice. So now what we'll do is we'll install a brand new pinion nut. This is really important. What can happen is if these pinion nuts come loose, the pinion will then drop down into the carrier and the vehicle will come to an immediate stop as the gear set gets itself stuck together. Some manufacturers do deem that you need to have a lock washer or some sort of spacer washer in the back there, or they require you to have a Loctite. So refer to the service information for your particular diff. All right, so our new pinion nut comes with the gear set, has a little bit of Loctite on it, so we'll thread that on, and then we'll start to drive this home. We are going to be fighting crushing the crush washer, so this does take a little bit of effort to get it to fully crush. We're going to be checking periodically for the depth. There shouldn't be that clunk you're hearing. Once we've eliminated that clunk, then we need to start going really slow and making sure we're checking our turning torque the entire time we're doing this. Okay, now we're at the point where there's no slack and we've started to compress the crush collar. I can tell just by how it's turning easily we're not quite there for getting the crush washer to the proper turning torque. The factory spec for a new set of bearings, which is our situation now, 15 to 35 inch-pounds of turning torque, so the amount of effort it takes to turn this pinion. What I like to do is personally, differentials will only ever get looser as time goes on, so I try to go towards the tighter end of the spectrum. So I'm going to be aiming for right about 30 inch-pounds of turning torque to be able to allow this to keep constant tension for another 100,000 miles. If you go the looser end, you're quicker to get out of your specification. So we'll get it a little bit farther and then we'll start to measure it. So at this point we do have some preload. One of the things I like to do is I like to take a brass hammer and a brass drift and just kind of give a little tap to both ends of the pinion gear. And what that usually does is that frees it up a little bit. It kind of shocks the rollers into falling back in line where they're supposed to go. If you find yourself getting a little tight, give it a couple love taps on either side of the pinion, and that will shock the bearing just slightly to where we will then have that preload that we need. So with our turning torque wrench, I'm measuring right at about 15 inch-pounds of turning torque. So let me bring you along. So you want to check in both directions too. It's also a good idea to make sure you spin the pinion a couple times, make sure there's no hard spots. You know, if you're spinning it and you get to a spot that's kind of hard and then comes free, typically that's a bearing that's just installed slightly crooked and you need to go back through and make sure you're correcting that. So we'll get it a little bit tighter. Like I said, our spec is 15 to 35, so technically this would be in spec. I'm gonna aim for just slightly tighter, simply because that way it won't come loose at a later date. All right, so we're just at the higher end of 25 inch-pounds of turning torque. I'm gonna leave it at that. It's feeling really pretty good. So if I use my turning torque wrench in both directions, we're just at the north end of 25 inch-pounds of turning torque. So at this point, our pinion's now set until we get our carrier in. What we'll have to do now is change out the ring gear onto the carrier, as well as change out the side bearings. We'll put the carrier assembly back in and set a preliminary backlash, and then double check our gear pattern. And from there we can either have to reset the pinion depth, which everything would have to come back out. But where this is right now for pinion preload is pretty good. I feel pretty confident that we can get the carrier in, have good backlash and gear pattern, and not have to take this all back apart, simply because this was just a wear issue. This wasn't any other issue going on with the diff. So we'll move on to that right now. All right, we'll move on now to putting on our new ring gear, as well as changing out our side bearings. Now, this differential does have an electronic locker on it, and this pump assembly, solenoid assembly, is very, very fragile and requires a special tool for removing these side bearings before anything can be taken off. Conveniently, I do have the special tool to do so. So we're going to first put on the anvil, then put on the adapter assembly to pull it. We have these adapter ends that have to go into notches for the actual limited slip assembly, and then this cone drops over the top to prevent them from splating out. We're then able to use an impact gun and drive the main collet down, and that will pull this bearing off. All right, so we've successfully removed our side bearing. The other side bearing isn't that big of an issue because we don't have the pump on it. It can come off in a traditional manner. This tool should work for that other side as well. From here, then we can lift the pump up. We have to lift the pump up very carefully because there's a series of O-rings that can be easily damaged. Then we can remove our ring gear. Now, these bolts that secure the ring gear are left-hand thread, meaning that you have to go to the right to loosen them up. Left tightens them up. From this point, we would replace all of them as well to make sure that we don't have anything coming loose. We're also going to take the ring gear and put it in the hot tank to try to expand it so that when we go to put the ring gear back onto the carrier, this slight interference fit that this has won't, it'll slide right on. The other way that you can do that is you can put these on a hot plate if you have it. So we'll move on to that. So I skipped ahead a little bit. I installed the side gears on the hydraulic press. I have a past video where I show how the hydraulic press is used, so it's pretty straightforward. So pressed 2 side bearings on the carrier and installed the ring gear, torqued it to spec. Right now I have it set up in the case. This particular differential, the Chrysler 8 1/4, is a bit of a fight to get the carrier into the differential case, because you have to fight the carrier itself, which is about 30-40 pounds, the two side bearing outer races, the bearing cap covers, and then the adjusters, because this isn't a adjuster shim style diff housing, so you have to fight quite a few things, so it takes, you know, multiple hands to do so. So I've already jumped ahead with that. The bearing cap bolts are 10 foot-pounds right now, and they're 10 foot-pounds because the bearing cap bolts have the threaded adjusters in them, and the threaded adjusters need to have some free spin to them when you're adjusting for backlash. So the backlash adjusters are doing two things. The first thing they're doing is they're giving the side bearings or preload. It is a taper roller bearings for the carrier side bearings, so they do require a little bit of preload for them to operate correctly and for a long life. And then the second thing it's doing is the backlash, and the backlash is the space between the ring gear contacting the pinion gear, and there needs to be a specific amount. In the case of this differential, it's between 5 8/1000ths of an inch. Much like with the turning torque of the Pinion, I prefer going on the tighter end of the scale, because the diff is only ever going to get looser over time. And the nice thing with the threaded adjusters is you can fine tune this to where you can get it right to where the spec you want to. Where I'm at right now is, if I check for backlash, I got to hold my pinion and move my ring gear up and down. I'm right at about 6/1000ths, 5 to 6/1000ths of an inch clearance, which is right in my spec window and on the tighter end of it. So the next step would be to tighten these bearing cap bolts. It's to 100 foot-pounds, and then double check it, and you check the backlash in 4 different places. After you've done that, then it's you can check the gear pattern. So we'll do that here in a little bit. So I'm going to check it in 4 different spots, torque the caps, and then move on to the gear pattern. So with the caps torqued to 100 foot-pounds, my backlash is right at 5/1000ths of an inch, so I'm right at the tight edge of the scale, which is where I prefer to be with these differentials, because they're only ever going to get loose. So what we're going to do now is we're going to check the gear pattern. So this is how the pinion gear and the ring gear are contacting each other. I personally like to use white lithium grease. The reason for that is you don't have to pre-mix it with gear oil. It doesn't stain the new gear fluid when it comes in, and it wipes off really pretty clean. So you do 3 or 4 teeth where you cover them in white grease, and you're going to do this in a couple different spots. I'm going to just do this in just one spot to show as an example. And essentially what we're doing is, as I rotate the diff, it's going to remove grease where the 2 gears are contacting. Now if we have the pinion depth correct and the backlash correct, we should get a gear pattern right in the middle with very little movement up or down. So we want it to be as dead center in the middle as possible, but not too high, not too low. Anything that's a variant of that will cause gear noise. So I've learned too, you turn this in the rotation to forward, and you use a rag and you preload it. So you add a little bit of drag to simulate you know, the tires on the ground. You're obviously not going to be able to put it through the same forces, but you can see a difference in the gear pattern when doing that. So after we've done our forward gear pattern check, we can see that our gear pattern is not too shallow. It's right in the middle. There's just a little edge where the other gear is not hitting, but we don't want it too deep and we don't want it too high. It's contacting nicely in the middle. So that's a good forward gear pattern. Now we'll go rotate it the opposite way for our coasting side, because the ring gear and pinion, or the gear set I should say, can make noise either direction. If you're accelerating and you're hearing the noise, it's on the accel side. If you're decelerating, it's on, or if when you're decelerating and you hear it, it's on the decel side of the gear. So we'll double check the gear pattern, same thing. Go backwards, give it a little bit of preload, rotate it around, and again, right there on our decel side, we have a really pretty good pattern. So the XL side and the decel side both look really nice. If there was an issue, so if, for instance, the grease was completely removed on the inside of the gear, right in the valley there, then we potentially could have a pinion depth issue. So we'd have to take the carrier back out, and use a scooter block and a dial indicator to measure for proper pinion depth. I reused the pinion shim at the beginning of the process, and that was to kind of speed things up. Knowing that there wasn't really an issue with the diff for a number of miles, I knew that putting a factory gear set in, everything should be okay. So if we have where the grease is only being worn on one end, that means the pinion is too far sunk down, or if it's too far the other way, that it's too deep and potentially causing a clashing issue. Now, if we have a depth issue, that's going to be for our backlash. Setting the backlash with the adjusters, if we turn this adjuster in to the right, then this will bring the ring gear into the pinion gear and make the backlash tighter. If we tighten this side in, it will move the carrier and ring gear away from the pinion gear and make it looser. So you have to kind of find the fine balance of not only keeping the bearing preload set, but also getting the correct backlash. So we have good depth, and it doesn't look like the pinion is sunk in or pushed out too much. It also rotates nice and smooth. For multiple rotations. It's a good idea before you set backlash, when you put these caps on, rotate the diff 4 or 5 times both directions to try to make sure everything's seated. The other thing to note too is to make sure that the electric locker assembly is in the right spot. So for this particular electric locker, we have 2 tabs that mounted on the case, and we know that this is the right side down because there's the intake for the fluid right there, and then our solenoid wire lines up. So from this point, what we do is I would lock down the adjusters with the little locking tabs. These are a bit of a fight to get in, but these go in and prevent the tabs from backing out. Throw the cover on it, axle shafts in, fluid in it, and then it's time for a test drive. Now the customer needs to drive this a little mellow, no towing, no real snappy acceleration for about 500 to 1,000 miles. And then it should be pretty good. The nice thing with diffs is there's really nothing to learn or anything like that. No computer controlled stuff. So you just get in it and drive it and make sure there's no noise. So with that, we'll wrap up this diff overhaul and move on to the next car. I appreciate you all taking the time to watch the video, and we'll see you in the next one.